This is the graphic translation introduction lecture for the ART161 graphic design course. In this project, we're going to talk about the concepts of abstraction, simplification, and as well stylization, and how we utilize these techniques as graphic designers to create simple marks and logos based on real imagery. So when we talk about graphic translation, this is really talking about the process of taking some sort of highly complicated sort of subject and abstracting that, simplifying it, and stylizing it within the real world. And this outcome should be a much more simplified and easily recognizable symbol or mark that represents as accurately as possible the original real world object. So these are some examples that we can see here. And basically, there's a lot of ways to approach this project. And this really comes down to the style that you are trying to go for. We can see these are all different examples here of lobsters, and these are actually pulled from the graphic translation book that's or the readings that are attached to the module as well. And we can see that these are lobsters from different angles and are represented in different ways. But even beyond that, there's a sense of simplification going on within all of these. They're only using the colors black and white. And there's also a sort of stylization process that's happening, an abstraction process. Some of these are a little bit more accurate to the actual image, while others take on a much more stylized approach, but they're all effective in the sense of communicating this overall shape of a lobster. So one of the key principles within this project is simplification. And this is exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, the process of making something that is somewhat complicated and simplifying that. And this allows us to easily recognize and understand what that object is. We're also going to be looking at abstraction. And this is the process of reducing something down to its most basic form and its most basic shapes. And this helps us, again, to communicate a large amount of information through the simplest shapes possible. Now, sometimes we can take things too far within the abstraction, or if we are going too realistic with that, it cannot necessarily communicate that quite as effectively. So typically you're trying to find that middle ground as far as what you need to be able to communicate that while still simplifying and abstracting the original content. Stylization really comes more into your particular choice of what you want your design to look like. And this can aid in simplification or abstraction, but it's really more about the mood or the style of the object or the mark. This can reference certain styles such as Art Deco, or it can be more decorative and not based on any specific time period. Rather, thinking about the line qualities, the shapes that you are using, and the way that you are applying that towards the overall design. Now for this project, your goal is to take two different objects, one being a mechanical object, something that is man-made, and the other being an organic object. A lot of times people choose animals for the organic object because it tends to lend itself well for this project. But you could do other organic objects as well, such as some sort of plant or some sort of food item, for example. So the process that we're going to start with within this project is collecting images. The first thing you want to do anytime you are thinking about a graphic translation is you want to do some research and get some ideas so that you can reference what the overall form is that you are trying to simplify, abstract, and stylize. So for each of these objects, the mechanical and the abstract object, you are going to be finding images, different images of the object that you have chosen. And based on the images that you've collected, you're going to choose one of those images for each object. In this case, they chose this small kitten here. And And once they have chosen the image, we can see in the bottom right-hand corner on the left here, the original image. You're going to go through a few different steps in Photoshop, turning the image into grayscale, posterizing the image, and then thresholding the image in only black and white. And these are intended to help you to get a better idea of the form and also think about ways that you can create closure within the object that you are working with. Now, once you have gone through these Photoshop treatments, then you're going to begin to sketch different ways that you could articulate this object. And again, this comes into the idea of stylization, whether you want to use sharper edges and more angular, like the top right sketch over here, or more curved, curvilinear lines, such as the bottom right-hand corner down here. These are both very similar, but also very different in the sort of stylization that the artist has applied to this. So as you get into this project, you want to think about specific references within the abstraction process that you can work with. Now, if we take this image of the house over here, we could see that we could generally put some sort of triangle along the top, some sort of square and rectangles within that, and that would generally communicate some sort of house. Now, as you can see, once you start to abstract that too far, we start to lose the original reference of what that is. So again, going back to that abstraction meter, you want to make sure that you're falling within that middle ground, bringing in elements that represent the form and the object so that the viewer is going to be able to decipher what that is, while at the same time putting in your own stylization. So let's look at these a little bit further. Simplification is really one of the more important tools within a successful illustration or drawing. And we want to think about how we can break down an object or a subject into these simple shapes that are easy to draw within the original sketches. So if any of you have ever taken a drawing class before, you might have used this practice, which is really taking some sort of object that might be rather complicated and thinking about the simple forms that this object is going to sit within. Now, sometimes you can think about this as a sort of invisible bounding box, almost as if you were creating some packaging for that item that was needed to hold that item. And within that particular shape, you can then start to sort of whittle away at different areas to get a much more accurate description of that object. So here we can see this pencil sharpener. If we look at this pencil sharpener, there's some intricate elements within this. But when we think about just that very, very basic form and the exterior lines of this object, we can think about this as a sort of three-dimensional box here. And once we have that three-dimensional box, then you can start to think about where those thumb grips are coming in and how those could pull into the space of your sketch as well, or the opening for the actual pencil in the pencil sharpener and how that would be shown within that space. It allows you to kind of break down the form in a little bit more of an accurate depiction. And that can be done with organic objects as well. Most of the time, we can break down illustrations into these simple shapes. Here we can see a pretty complicated seagull, but when we really break this down, we can see that can be communicated through simple shapes such as ellipses and triangles and squares to roughly articulate the exterior form of this. And then you can go in and start to create more detail within that form. Here we see another example of a watering can and the way that we can simplify this, whether it's creating more of a three-dimensional or two-dimensional sketch. Now, once you have the overall form, then you can start to think about some abstraction to this. And when we think about abstraction, you want to start to identify features of the subject and begin to abstract the line and shape quality to create a more stylized mark. So here we can see the original images in this sort of process below that allows the artist to get to a much more simplified, much more stylized approach based on the images that they have collected and the sketches they have created. So you can see down here in both of these cases, they're looking at the overall shape and some key characteristics to allow the viewer to figure out what this object is. So in the case of the elephant here, they're looking at the tusks and these large ears and the trunk. And based on just a few of those simple elements, your mind is starting to already decipher what this is, and it makes it much easier as an artist to be able to create that abstraction and still retain the overall communication of what that object is. Once you have done your simplification and abstraction, this is where you can start to put your own sort of flavor into the sauce, right? Thinking about the stylization or your interpretation of this. Most of the time when you're abstracting, you're thinking about the line quality and the shape quality, and you can do the same thing with stylization and abstraction. Whether you want to, again, have sharper edges or more curvilinear lines. Do you want to use points or solid shapes to articulate that? How can you take the original form and create that abstraction where you're still making it recognizable as an object, but simplifying the object down from its very detailed characteristics? And there's a lot of ways to approach this. When we think about the stylization of an object, you can think about, again, different time periods that you might want to reference, different sort of patterns, different mark making techniques. But it is important to remember that eventually your sketches are going to be brought into Adobe Illustrator and vectorized. So thinking about this, you want to stay away from really sketchy qualities because those do not typically translate as well within vector shapes. Remember that we are working with the pen tool and shape tools to articulate this. So there does need to be some sort of quality to the mark that is going to allow you to convert this into vectorized objects eventually. And if you have a very sketchy sort of quality to your lines, that's going to be much harder to translate. Now, going back to some of these basic principles of design, we can use these within this project as well. And one of those principles that we worked on within the visual principles assignment is the figure ground relationship, or positive and negative space. And this allows you to use separate shapes in a design to include the background as a form as well, using the white of the page, if you will. Now, for this project, you're only going to be using black and white. So that can be used to your advantage. The white of the page can act as a sort of space within the design as well. You want to try to build a relationship within these elements where it will start to fill in the gaps, identify this hidden motion within the design. Now, in order to use this effectively, you're going to tie this into another principle of design called closure. And this makes the use of space as gaps between elements. And it allows us as viewers to sort of fill in those gaps where there is no information and complete a whole from the parts. This goes back to the Gestalt principles. Now, too much space and no closure occurs, and too little space and no closure is needed. So you want to think about that correct balance within the sense of closure here. Here we can see the panda for the World Wildlife Federation logo that uses closure very effectively. And this ties into the positive and negative space as well. They're using the white of the page to show parts of the form here. And even though there's no direct line at the top of the head, our eyes kind of fill in the gaps, if you will. And that's based really on the positioning of where these ears are and where these additional shapes lead our eye to. We can start to see that this is a general circular form up at the top of the head without even having an actual line there to articulate that. So for this assignment, you're going to look at the process of taking real world objects and subjects and using a graphic process to simplify, abstract, and stylize the object to become a much more simple and easily identifiable mark. And this is really integral to the design process of creating different illustrations, and is also very helpful in the use of creating logos. In the end, you're going to be creating 2 graphic translations in total. One is going to be based on a mechanical object, something that is man-made, and the other on an organic object. As you're choosing your images to begin this project, make sure that you're thinking about the pose of the organic object or animal for example, or the point of view of the mechanical object. And when you're collecting these images, think about a view of the object that is going to be descriptive in the overall silhouette. If you follow up with the readings for this week within the graphic translations readings, you'll see that there's a thing called a silhouette test. And that's essentially taking the image that you've chosen and thinking about making it into a solid black object based on the outline of that. Now, if this is still identifiable within that silhouette, then it's likely going to have a stronger graphic translation than something that is not. So this is kind of an example of this. If we think about the elephant here and this sort of silhouette test based on these different points of view of the elephant, we can see that the one over on the right, this side view, is probably the clearest because we can clearly see all of the legs. None of them are hidden behind there. We can see the elements such as part of the ear and the trunk and the tusk, and these are very clearly identifiable elements to the elephant. Now, some of these tend to get a little bit more obscured when you look at these other point of views. So this is a good way to kind of test your imagery to make sure that it's a good image to choose to then convert into sketches and your final graphic translation. Based on all the images that you have collected for your reference, 15 images in total, for each object, you're then going to choose one image for each object and open them up in Photoshop. And you're going to go through the process of adjusting the levels, turning the image black and white or grayscale, as well as utilizing the threshold and posterize functions. Once you have sufficient source material, you're going to start to sketch out your objects. Now, you can use tracing paper if you'd like to, and the goal here is to really simplify that image, gradually reducing it to a much more abstracted and simplified state. And be sure to keep all the steps to include in your final PDF submission for this assignment as well. So here we can see an example. This student chose a cat for their organic object. Now, they've collected all of the images that are needed for this. And based on the images that they have collected, they've chosen one image that they've then taken into Photoshop to do these different treatments of grayscale, posterization, and threshold. And they're using those images that they have taken into Photoshop to then translate these into their sketches here on the left. You can see that the sketches go from a little bit more of a detailed sort of sketch into a much more abstracted and stylized sketch as they move through the process. Now you'll also look at the line quality and shape qualities of these. The more effective graphic translations in these cases are the ones that use the principle of closure and positive and negative space, and that also use much more defined shapes and lines within the space versus something that is somewhat more of a sketchy quality like in the bottom left-hand corner. So once you have completed your sketches, you're going to post those into the discussion and ultimately make a decision based on those 4 sketches, which one you want to pursue. And based on that, you're going to bring that into Adobe Illustrator and start to digitally translate this using the pen tool and shape tools. Now consider what shapes should be closed paths and what should be open strokes. Closed paths, remember, can be stroked or filled with a color at will without juggling objects that are in front or behind others, while strokes are going to be simply a line you can apply a stroke to, but cannot create a fill for that shape. So if we look at the translation here, we can see that this is a nice combination of both. Some of these are using lines, while others are using full shapes to create that closure, that nice graphic quality on the page, and highlight some of the form of this particular object. So that should get you started on the graphic translation project. Make sure to refer to the module for the tutorial and assignment sheet, and please reach out if you have any questions.